listening to Citizens History, a podcast by some guys asking how an awareness of history might help us to identify and address the most urgent challenges facing the United States and the world. Welcome to Season 2, Episode 2. Wherever you are and however you may be listening, we're glad you're here. I'm Podrick Rowan, a historian at Quincy University. Today is the 29th of March, 2025. And we are delighted to welcome to the podcast Jeff Gibbs, Jeffrey Wade Gibbs, whose book, The Peril of Remembering Nice Things, is recently out. I met Jeff in Istanbul back in 2008, and I feel a deep connection to this book. We're going to discuss it today, and the mix of the personal and the political, the exploration of how family drama reverberates through the generations and connects to the big picture, is a great model for how to do history and of how to discover surprising connections between cultures. As always, we invite you to become part of the conversation and welcome your comments, your criticism, and your suggestions for future episodes. So welcome, Jeff. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Well, thank you very much for having me. Of course.
Now, I do want to address, before we get into this wonderful book, I do want to address one of the central themes of the book, but then it's also, directly relevant right now, both for the United States and for Turkey. This theme of oppression and frankly fuckery in both the context of the United States and in the context of Turkey. And so, can you break down where you are right now, what neighborhood of Istanbul you're in, how life is right now in just beyond the personal, like with politics, with everything that you and your extended family are going through, and please can you break it down for us?
Well, our current situation, I suppose we live in the neighborhood of Üsküdar, which for listeners, I suppose, is one of the oldest settlements in the area, but it's kind of, we're right next to Çamlıca Hill. And currently in Turkey, I don't know how many are following the news, but the mayor of Istanbul, who was elected by popular vote not once but twice, because the first time he was elected, the President Erdogan canceled the election, saying that it was corrupted. So they had a second election, and he was elected by overwhelming majority the second time. So he was elected twice, was just removed from office, I think about 2 weeks ago now, and on false charges of corruption and terrorism. He's been jailed, just like all the other opposition leaders have been jailed, and their protest in the universities and in the streets around the mayor's office. But they've been, brutally suppressed. Not as brutally as I suppose they would be in Syria, but like police are out in full force with tear gas, riot shields, riot batons. There have been, I think, at this count, 1,800 arrests, one of which is our cousin, my wife's cousin, but he was arrested just yesterday, or 2 days ago, I'm sorry. He was sentenced yesterday to house arrest. One of our friends was arrested and has not been released. Another friend was arrested, a photographer who took some pictures at the protest. They raided his house on Monday morning. But if you go outside, nothing really looks all that different. I wish it did. I wish the people in more areas were protesting and rising up, because this is unprecedented. I mean, there have been protests against Erdogan before, but this is the first time that he's tried to so blatantly destroy a rival with no, like, the excuses coming out of the government are absurd. They're just to listen to that shit. Sorry, cussing, but to listen to that garbage is the excuse is that the CHP party, which is opposed to Erdogan's party, is full of corruption now, and so the government needs to take it over to clean it up. They want a healthy opposition party, of course, because that's what democracy means, but they need to clean it up first. So they're going to take it over, clean it up, and then they'll give it back. No problem. So that's the story in the mainstream media over in Turkey now, is that this is all happening because the government wants to clean up the opposition's corruption. Anyway, the day that our cousin was arrested, I saw the arrest of the Tufts student, the Turkish Tufts students who I cannot, her last name was
Yeah.
Öztürk, Rumeysa
Rumeysa
Öztürk,
Öztürk,
Rumeysa
yeah,
Öztürk. Like, wow, okay, so here we are moving in parallel.
totally. Yeah, it seems if we want a glimpse of the future of the United States, we could do worse than to look at Turkey. It's it potential future, hopefully avoidable future, but yes, when we are arresting people, when masked plainclothes agents are arresting uh, people for expressing opposing viewpoints, we are definitely in a pickle.
And the attacks on the universities now. I mean, I'm watching that the Trump administration specifically is going after very purposely and openly to cow the universities, and that's exactly what's happening here now. Most of these protests are taking place at the universities. The government is putting exceptional pressure on the universities now to cleanse them. Bosphorus University, which is, I suppose, the best state university in Turkey, not the equivalent of a Columbia, but nevertheless prestigious, right, has been under siege for a couple of years now. They're armed guards. I have one of my friends is the dean of literature there. Armed guards everywhere. Students are taken away as soon as they show any signs of dissent. They had the dean of several departments was removed and then replaced by government minders. So it's a similar issue.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. The universities, the legal profession. Um, a friend of mine in Turkey she had gone to Bosphorus, Boğaziçi University back in the day.
Hmm.
She's probably about my age, maybe a little bit older than me. Um, but yeah, she was involved in protests. This must have been back in the very late '80s or early '90s, and she was
Hmm.
thrown in jail for several years. She actually, for the crime of protesting on campus. Um, so yeah, this goes back a long, long way. This this inability to distinguish between legitimate opposition and treason. Um, like, could before we move to the U.S. context and to the roots of your book,
Hmm.
could you also give us a little bit of background, because your wonderful wife Dalal figures prominently in this book, and
Mm, yep.
has occurred. This is one of the main. This is one of the things that you talk about a lot. Could you give us a tiny bit of background on that and how that is playing out today?
On her Kurdishness, like just who she is, my relation, and what's going on with that.
Well, first, not everyone is aware of the Kurdish situation in Turkey.
Right.
And so could you give us a tiny bit of background, and then how that shows up, particularly for Dalal and her family?
Okay. Well, in Turkey, there are several minorities. I think the largest minority is Kurdish, and uh, they were here long before anybody else was. They're connected to the original Mesopotamian uh, Aryan peoples that were here, and Aryan, not in Nazi Aryan, but Aryan is in the
Right, the
tribes. Like,
Indo-Europeans.
yeah, and so it's about 20% of the population in Turkey. They mostly live in the southeast. They used to have, back in the Ottoman times, when there was vilayet system where each people had its own region. There used to be an area called Kurdistan, and when it became a republic, everyone became Turkish, and it was illegal to call yourself anything but Turkish. But of course, there's a Kurdish identity, a Kurdish language, um, Kurdish culture that's different, even Kurdish food, and these were all suppressed. Mentioning them was uh, suppressed. Until recently, it was even considered terrorism to say the word Kurdistan or suggest that there was a different culture, and still is informally, I think. Anyway, so my wife is Kurdish, kind of coming out of all that um, suppression, repression, oppression, and she's also a Alevi, which is a minority. I don't even, it's not even a minority sect in Islam. It's uh, to me, it reminds me a lot of Mexican Catholicism, where you have a lot of the native indigenous beliefs kind of covered with a veneer of Christianity, and so it looks like it's Catholic, but really a lot of the ceremonies underneath are these old pagan rituals from indigenous peoples. So it's very similar to that. Like I know that her grandmother used to wake up and say a prayer to the moon or to the sun. There are these sacred places in the mountains where you go to give offerings because then there are nature spirits there. Anyway, so she's a Levi, a minority within a minority. So like the general Turkish state does not like the Kurdish minority, and then within the Kurdish people, they're mostly Sunni Muslim. Many of them do not like the Alevis because they're not proper Muslims. So she's kind of a minority of a minority, and their family's always been super politically active. Super politically active. Everyone is well aware of everything that's happened in the last 100 years, read up on their history. They have everyone has a political stance that they are very educated upon. They don't just say something because they saw it on Facebook. They've experienced it. They've read history books. They're like her father's house has got 10 times as many books as I have, and they're all on politics, like very aware. They grew up, she grew up in the 80s when it was illegal to speak Kurdish. In fact, in their village, I know that the children of this village school were told to inform on their parents if they spoke Kurdish. Her father was a school teacher, and in Turkey, school teachers are their school is decided by the government. So if you're a public school teacher, the government will decide where you teach. And because of his politics, they changed his school almost every year. So they were constantly moving as kind of a not he wasn't arrested, but like had some they were poking him, annoying him, like making his life difficult. There were a couple of times he was arrested. I think one of my favorite stories, I think that kind of gives my wife's personality. She was 4 or 5, I think it was that age, and her dad was taken in by the gendarmes in the town that they were living in, and her mother thought that it would be a good idea to take Dalal along because if she took her little daughter and his little daughter, then she could get pity from the gendarmes because people were disappearing at that time, like never coming back. So she's like, I'll go take my little girl, and they'll say, oh, she's so cute, and let her father go. And then apparently they'll all marched up to the gendarmes at 4 and like, you let my daddy go. So, and this was a time when they were killing people. So to me,
Yeah, extrajudicial killings all over the place, bodies never found, that kind of thing. Oh
that
gosh.
embodies who she is.
Yeah, it does. It really does. Gosh. And we'd be remiss in uh, not mentioning the last time her dad was jailed. Could you tell that story very briefly?
Yeah, and actually, it's really important in terms of how I wrote this book. It was in 2011. We had just been married. Um, I don't know if am I allowed to mention my personal connection with you?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely, absolutely.
Okay, so, I have 2011, we had concert tickets. I remember that night we met you at a restaurant in Kadikoy, and she got the news that day. And I think as we were talking, if I remember correctly, we were talking to you, and then as we left, she goes, well, we can't go to the concert. I need to go to Aksaray. What? And Aksaray, of course, is where the security office is, and she finally kind of told what had happened, that her father had been arrested that day. Apparently, they'd come to the house at 6 in the morning, took him away after searching the house, and then he was in jail for 3 years. And this was part of an operation rounding up uh, any Kurdish dissidents. And by dissidents, I mean at the time there was a political party that the Kurds were majority in. I don't like the press always uses this pro-Kurdish party as if the rest are anti-Kurdish, but it was a
Right, right.
party where yeah, it was a party, political party where the majority were Kurds, and he was they all the political parties here have academies where they train their people. So he was a Kurdish language teacher at their party's academy, and he was arrested for terrorism. Supposedly, some unidentified witnesses had recordings of him supporting the PKK in the mountains or something. It was all nonsense. But he and I think the estimate is 10,000 people were arrested and then just never released. And we spent 3 years going back and forth to ridiculous trials. I mean, one of the trials, and I mentioned this in the book, one of the there's this list of foreigners that they're saying, here are the agents that you work with. We know that you're working for foreign agents trying to topple the Turkish government. And of course, my mother was one of them, and my Japanese friends. And it's like, wait, these people were guests at my daughter's wedding. That's my, that's my daughter's mother-in-law. So, we apparently, and my entire family, were foreign spies.
Were all the foreigners, you know, who were with you in Turkey, were we on that list too? Like, 'cause
I, I
it never
guess.
happened that like it was routine for me in my 8 years in Turkey that you know people would first assume that I was German, I guess because of my height and my
Sure.
how I look. And then when I found I was an American speaking Turkish to them, they automatically assumed I was CIA. It was just no question. It was the most common assumption anyone ever made. Um,
Sure.
yeah, yeah,
Well, that's how I mean, on an aside, when I first met Delal, she thought I was CIA
yeah, yeah.
because I was trying to speak Turkish. We met at a cafe and I was coming from a music lesson and I had
Limon
my,
Cafe, yes, yes.
the Limon Cafe, right? And I had my ney with me, which is this traditional Sufi Turkish instrument.
I remember it.
And
Yeah.
then, so I was bringing that. I played this song that I thought was Kurdish because my teacher was Kurdish. So I told her, hey, I can play a Kurdish song. And then I played this song that turns out to be an Armenian tune. So she goes, okay,
Oh wow.
here's this foreigner speaking Turkish, carrying a ney that he says he can play a Kurdish song on because his teacher is Kurdish, but it's an Armenian song. She's like, what the hell? This guy's CIA. Which I always thought was ridiculous. I mean, why would a CIA agent be so, um, why would we want to stand out so much?
Right,
Ridiculous. But
right.
anyway, he was released 3 years later. And that was the first 3 years of our marriage. It was rough.
Yeah.
And then he was released 3 years later, finally. But his trial I mean, he's still technically sentenced, so they could pick him up at any time. It's just that they've kind of forgotten this particular purge because it was done in partnership with the Gulen movement, who they have since purged this
Right,
movement. So to bring it back up is a little awkward. But
right.
he's technically still arrested. I mean, he doesn't have a passport, and it's bizarre.
I went down to one of those court proceedings. I
That's
remember.
right.
Yeah, yeah. It was the most Kafka-esque thing you can imagine. Just huge busts of Ataturk and how many people? It was at least 100, maybe more. All get defendants all getting tried collectively, right?
Yeah,
Uh,
it was about 100, yeah, in his group.
yeah, yeah.
And that was like where at one of those trials, um, there were just so many. I can't say there was one major connection to my father, but there were a lot of little ones that came together. And one of them was at one of those trials. one of our Kurdish friends came up and said, "Oh, I'm so glad to see you here. Thanks." He's like, "Supporting your father-in-law." I'm like, "Yes." He goes, "I bet this is the first time that you've ever had to support a relative in prison. I mean, was your father ever in prison?" And I think, well, I thought about it, like, yeah, but not really for anything remotely similar. And it just kind of one of the things that started in my head a conversation between my father and father-in-law. This kind of I had this imaginary conversation between them and with both of them.
Yeah.
But
Yeah. Yeah.
with
Gosh,
with
this is probably a great time to transition. Now, okay, we have the at least a little bit of the Turkish background. Now, can you give us the background on uh, where you grew up? Uh, your father, of course, plays a central role in the book, but before we go to the large scale comparisons to be made, could you just give us a little background on because this is a memoir. It's a wonderful history precisely because it's so personal. Um,
Mhm.
it gives us a sense of the living history. It's not merely dry as dust, or it's really, really appealing to ordinary people for that reason.
Well, thank you. And well, I grew up in Central Florida in Lakeland, which is a small city. Although by Turkish Istanbul standards, it's a small town. But anyway, it's a small city in the center, the geographic center of the state. It is not remotely enlightened. It is very much an agricultural town still, um, very conservative religiously and politically, although that's changing slowly. But when I grew up, it was very conservative, both politically and religiously. And then my father, well, we lived with him for a few years, and then my parents got divorced. Well, no, okay, no, they didn't. They separated because of his drinking, and he moved in with his mother, who lived in the northern part of the state, in the lake region, like out in the woods. So she had a house on a lake out in the woods. So he lived with her, and I would go back and forth from Lakeland to basically the woods up north and stay with them at the lake house. And then later he moved like various places near her, but still in the woods. Although technically speaking, I suppose like those little towns in the woods are much older than Lakeland where I grew up. They date some of them to pre-Civil War
Okay.
and still have that like very old southern atmosphere. So Lakeland was a bit more cosmopolitan in that sense. We had a lot of Puerto Ricans, some Hispanic influence, but up in North Florida, it was the old South.
Yeah. And so, how did I loved part of what I loved about the book is the the descriptions of food,
Mm,
the dialogue you do. It reminds me a little bit of um, how well Mark Twain does dialogue. Like when you're interviewing people, you're talking with your sister, your aunt, or whoever, and they're uh, it's just you really capture it in a wonderful way. Like who are the so I think of Twain. Maybe you're not thinking of that. Who are your kind of models, I guess, when you write, and or who were your models when you were starting out? Because I've seen this uh, previous projects of yours that certainly have fed into this, and it's a really I want to ask it of all writers, but I won't. But what would you say?
well, my biggest influence on this book is William Styron, I think, because I've read all of his books, but in particularly Sophie's Choice and um, The Confessions of Nat Turner. Both
Okay,
are historic. They're based on histories, and
yeah,
he weaves with Sophie's Choice. He weaves history and a personal experience together into um, a really compelling story. But he's also Southern, so he uses the voice of a Southern orator. Like you can feel this Southern storyteller
right, right,
in his books. And the same with the Confessions of Nat Turner, although he doesn't go back into the history quite as much. It's told from the perspective of Nat Turner himself. But that was a model. But then, like all the Southern authors, like Flannery O'Connor, whenever I think of my aunt, Flannery O'Connor pops into mind. The voice of my aunt, which is very gothic, I think, and absurd. Um, Flannery O'Connor's characters come to mind, and then Faulkner is an inescapable influence, just inescapable for all sorts of reasons. But I think those three, and I'm sure latently, Mark Twain is, I mean, we studied him in middle and high school and such a big part of the culture down there. So I think probably yes, but actively speaking, Styron and O'Connor and Twain. No, sorry, and Faulkner.
Yeah, yeah.
I'm not saying I write as good as these people. I'm just saying their influence.
No, of course, man. I so there's a background beyond the personal, and I do want to get to that, but there's a background to the um like one of the main themes of the book, one of the main core events from which you weave your tale, is a lynching. And
Hmm.
so, can you give us a little bit of background on this? You've done a lot of amateur sleuth work to track down. I
Yep.
mean, it's really impressive research. Like, how does this figure in the whole story?
Well, well, it figures because I mean, I have to get a bit more complicated in how I found out about it, but I'll start there. And I describe this in the book, so it's a spoiler. But my grandmother, my father's mother, who that's the woman that he lived with, that we all kind of considered as a villain in the family, someone that was responsible for most of our family's issues. Um, After he died, I'd gone to visit her one last time, and she, as was her habit, would say, "I want you to go through the house and tell me what you want when I die, and I'll will it to you." And I'm like, "That's okay, really morbid, but look," I told her, "the only thing that I want is this book of family history." And I pulled down this book of Gibbs family history, and she told me, "You can go ahead and take that." I'm like, great. So I flipped through it. There was this passage about my great great grandfather having owned two slaves, and I said to her, "I was like, wow, it's so odd to think that so close in our family history, like someone so close to us owned slaves." And then she goes, "Well, that reminds me of a story." And I asked her what it was, and she's told this story of when she was a little girl, they heard some noise out in the front yard, and her mother took her out on the front porch and all the children because she didn't want them to be alone. And when they got outside, it was nighttime. They'd been woken up from sleep. There was all the black families in the neighborhood just standing in Mama's yard. And they said, "Oh, please, Miss Lenny, they're killing everybody. Can we hide in your cane field?" And she goes, "Oh, Mama let them hide in her cane field, and they hid there till morning when they ran off." I'm like, "Wait, what? What was happening?" And she said, "Well, this little girl named Laureen had been killed by an old black man, and so the town got after him, and my brother and my father were out on the posse and trying to catch him, and they were just tearing up the countryside and hurting some of these poor people, and so these poor people came to us to hide because they knew Mama would. She just had a heart of gold. She couldn't hurt a fly." And she went on and on about how nice her mother was. Couldn't tell if it was a critique or praise, but anyway, uh, then she kind of paused and she said, "Now, I hate to tell you this, and this is embarrassing, but they caught that they caught that black man, and they they set him on fire, and then they cut off his genitals and sewed them up in his mouth." I was shocked. I mean, it was so
Yeah.
gruesome. Like so gruesome, first of all. I think that was shocking. But then that like she was choosing this time. She had a few more years to live. If I couldn't figure out if she was ashamed of this and telling me, or why was it coming up? Why this is not the kind of thing you talk about in the South or in our family. Wasn't sure what she was trying to do, if this was an apology almost to me for what happened to my father. I don't know. It was such an odd confession from a woman who never talked about these things. And then that's how it stood. I tried to find out about the lynching. I did some research. This was back in analog times, and there was no internet. And I went to a couple local libraries. There was nothing. I looked up his. She told me the name of the black man killed was John Henry, and I looked up that name. Couldn't find anything. Um, So it just dried up. The story dried up, and or the trail dried up, I suppose. And then when I was thinking about writing this book, um, it kind of just popped into my head like, now there's the internet, and I was in Turkey at the time. It's like, let me see, Georgia, John Henry. Typed it into Google, and the first article that came up was this blog called Strange Fruit, where this woman was cataloging lynchings for every day of the year. And so June 19th was this, or yeah, June 19th was this one. And there it was. All of the place names weren't correct. I understood that my grandmother lived in Adel, Georgia, and this was in Autryville, which is an hour and a half away, about an hour today away by car. Back
Okay.
then it would have been longer. And I was like, well, that doesn't make sense that people would flee for that distance. So I didn't think it, wasn't sure that this could be the right John Henry. Um, but then as soon as I started digging around in census data and asking relatives, I found out that my grandmother's family were living in Autryville at the time, working as my great grandfather working as an overseer. But all that was like after digging. I had to go into the census data. I had to go on online heritage websites. I had to go and interview lots of relatives. And I started finally piecing together, found their address, found the road that they lived on. You can keep track through census data of who their neighbors were. So I kind of was able to draw a map of who lived around them. I went to the local libraries who have lots of old maps and phone books. And so piece by piece, it all kind of started to come together until I finally had the story. And that's how I found out about the lynching. But, with the lynching in mind, when my father-in-law was finally released from prison, it was on my mind. And he, he was holding court at home with all of the people who come to express their condolences for him having been imprisoned, and also just to see him. And I mean, friends, neighbors, all the house was full of people. And I went in and sat next to him as the only son-in-law at the time. And then this is Jeff, my son-in-law. And then he goes, we Kurdish people have always admired your civil rights movement. It was so well organized and so successful. I'm like, yes, thank you. And it's like, not thank you. I didn't say thank you. Yes, yes, it was. And he said, I'd like to know, what were your parents doing in the civil rights movement? How were they involved? I thought, well, actually, I have no idea. My mother is very vehemently apolitical, so I wasn't surprised that she wasn't involved, but that my father, who talked about almost nothing with me but politics and history, that topic never came up, that we never discussed it, that I never knew anything about his views on it, seemed odd. And so it kind of that's what made me connect my father's death with the bigger history, was kind of going back and just answering his question, what the hell was my father doing during the civil rights movement and then before, because we had a lynching in our background. And I didn't write this in the book, but because it was getting too long, but there's another one. On his father's side, I wasn't able to make a direct connection because I never met the man. But when his grandfather was 12 years old, there was a lynching in his very small town of Tai Tai, which at the time I think had 2,000 people. I cannot imagine that he was not involved with
Tai Tai, Georgia.
Tai Tai, Georgia. And it was a guy named Ed Henderson who was lynched from a telephone pole where there is now an African American church, and the whole town came out to watch. And the person, like, there was a little boy who accused this man of raping his sister. The sister did too, of course, but the boy was the witness, and he was the same age as my great grandfather. And when I just poked around in the World War I draft records, I found that these two, this boy who did the accusation and was served as witness, and my great grandfather, went together to register for the draft. So it makes me think that they were friends, you know, and I'm just sure that he was part of that, at least had witnessed that lynching as a child. And so I began just thinking, like, that kind of violence being part of your everyday life and being normalized. I mean, it doesn't just stop with mean, come on, it doesn't just stop with some black men that you're accusing of a crime. That has to pervade your soul, and it has to corrupt the society, and it has to corrupt the people who see it. It has to, I mean, why is my grandmother bringing it up 75 years later if it doesn't have some sort of impact on her? And she's the one that ruined my father. I don't, it's, so I started to think about how these, specifically the abuse, oppression, and cruelty of whites on blacks affected the whites. I think there's a quote by James Weldon Johnson, um, black author, civil rights leader, who was also from Florida, that said the civil rights movement is a fight for the black man's body and the white man's soul. And that really, I read that around this time, and I think that really rang true. It's like
Yeah.
the victim is a victim, like, of course, but the person perpetrating it is corrupting something that you'll never get back. I mean, a victim, even though I know victims feel guilty, should never feel guilty. They should never, their soul should never be dirtied. But the perpetrator, like, that's corrupting your soul. So that's how the lynching kind of connected with my father-in-law, and
Yeah.
kind of where I started pulling personal history and connecting it to a bigger history.
Yeah. Gosh. Yeah. It reminds me of James Baldwin said something similar. He was like, the question is not what's going to happen to black people in this country. The question is what's going to happen to this country. Like,
Yeah.
um, it's you can't do any more to me than you've already done. It's gosh, it's harrowing. It really is. And so you this would be a good time to go into detail on your dad. Your dad's suicide is a huge part of this book. And
Yeah.
I mean, I really I want to I want to be clear. I'm this is such a vulnerable book. This is such it's a wonderful book precisely for this reason. And so you mentioned you all called her Mima, right?
Yes.
The ways in which like what was his relationship like with his mother, and how does she kind of not to absolve them of responsibility, right? But we're all kids at some point. We are just hugely influenced by our parents. Like how how did their relationship play out from childhood into his adulthood?
Well, I mean, I took a whole book to figure that out, so it's going to be hard to. I'll summarize though,
Yeah.
because it's complicated. But okay, so he killed himself in 1996. I mean, this. Gosh, so the story was that he was he'd been living with her at that point, I think, for 20 years, mostly not working, but occasionally he would get a job, move out, then start drinking again, get fired, and then have to move back in with his mother. Usually she would, when he first came back, would have him committed somewhere, or maybe he would go to jail for a little bit, or be in some, like, there was a mental hospital at one point, but then eventually he would come back and live with her. This was pretty standard procedure. So I was living in Japan at the
Standard for her,
time.
standard for the relationship, or
Yeah, standard for their relationship. He lives with her, doesn't work, finds a job, moves out, drinks too much, gets fired. Instead of taking him back, she would send him to some sort of either mental hospital, prison, uh, some sort of alcohol treatment place. And then he would come back and live with her again. And this was a cycle. So I was living in Japan at the time, I got news that he had disappeared, and I wasn't surprised because it was the same sort of thing. Like he started drinking, she kicked him out of the house, and I'm pretty sure she's put him somewhere, but I don't know where. And he'll turn up again, I figured. And then I got the call from my sister that he had been found. He was staying in this halfway house. It's still a halfway house. This old hotel in Stark, Florida, and he'd been staying there. He apparently, according to some, the hotel bill was being paid for by my grandmother, but she never admitted it. According to others, it was being paid for by his cousin, although he also did not admit it. I don't know who was paying for the bill, but I'm assuming probably both of them. And then after a month of staying there, whoever was paying said they're not going to pay anymore. And he went out on the railroad tracks and sat and waited for the morning freight train to hit him, which is what happened. It was a very theatrical death. Like, yeah, obviously, as the son of this man, it was devastating. But as a writer, like I could just picture, it was so Southern Gothic. Like, here's this father staying amongst all of these alcoholics and druggies and ex-cons in this hotel, sneaking out at night after his crazy mother stopped paying for the hotel room, sitting on the railroad tracks, and then the freight train hitting him and his body flying. I think it was 80 feet, and then the whole town shutting down because they were blocking the tracks that connected the two parts of the town. Like, this is so Southern Gothic. As a writer, and I think as a storyteller, it really just was so vivid in my mind. But so I like, what kind of relationship, what kind of child, mother-son relationship produces this where, and he hated her, by the way. Like, he lived with her, but he hated her. Like, he never called her mother, called her Nell. He didn't even call her mother in third person. Like, if he would talk about her um, to me when she wasn't around, he didn't say the word mother. He didn't say the word father either. Um, he called them both by their first names. He told me, like, I knew he hated his mother, and like, but you live with her. What is that like to live with someone that you hate, that is your mother for decades, and to know that you can't ever escape? And like, just trying to figure. And he was a bright man who knew a lot of history and politics, trying to figure out what kind of relationship produced this kind of family dynamic. I still don't know. I I dug around people who remember them, and there wasn't much telling. I do know that there's a whole chapter dedicated to his father, but no one would talk about his father. But the little that I know of his dad, I know that he was also an alcoholic, that he could be physically abusive, which is something I mean, I thought about it more after finishing the book about his physical abuse. And the few stories that my grandmother told me about my father's father were things like, we tried to escape him. So one night when he was off drunk, we moved, and we just figured that he wouldn't be able to find us if we moved towns. We moved somewhere else. Like, how would you go about in those days finding the address of someone who didn't want to be found? But he always turned up. Like, so several times you just moved when he was, lost somewhere, drunk or in prison. Apparently, my grandfather was also in prison a lot for being drunk. So yeah, whenever he disappeared, we'd move to try to get away from him, but he always found us. Okay, so that was a clue. I thought there's something going on there. I never
Well,
really found out. I
yeah,
know,
it's kind of trauma just gushing through the generations, that no doubt
right.
she would have
I,
been subjected to this kind of abuse as well.
I guess,
Um,
but that's the thing. Like, that's what I thought. So I asked a lot about her parents, and her mother, Linny, was revered um, by by the entire county. Everyone knows Linny Hamner and how sweet she was. Like, when I started researching this book, I already knew that people thought of this way about Linny, but they called her Miss Linny. But when I started asking people, old people who are still in the town, they're like, "Oh, we just love Miss Linny. She was the sweetest person. She would give away candy and cookies to any black or white child that walked into her store." And then my older relatives always said, I don't, like, my aunt's favorite things, like, "I don't know how that thing came out of that sweet woman." That thing being my grandmother. And and her father, I don't know, he's apparently just kind of average, just wasn't particularly abusive or nice, but everyone remembered him as just a very kind man. I don't know. I mean, this is how people, the stories that people tell me, this is what people remember, but I don't know how true it is. I mean, he was also on a posse. This is what he and his oldest son went out on a posse to burn a man alive and stuff his genitals in his mouth. But then, from what I understand, the whole town, every man in town would have been required to do the same, or else suspected of, collaborating or, I
Yeah, gosh.
I don't
Yeah,
know.
collaborating in like just not being a fine upstanding wasp, that kind of thing. Or like you
Yeah,
just
I mean,
you're
it,
not a full citizen unless you're participating in a tangible way in these horrors of Jim Crow. Kind
and
of like
there's
that.
the murder of the girl in the lynching was pretty brutal. She was 13 or 12. She was 12 or 13. Almost beheaded her, whoever did this, and left her in the pond. So it was a brutal murder. And to have, they thought in their heads, I'm assuming they thought they had the guy. And so to not be one of the people that went out and brought him to justice would be betrayal. And
Right,
I,
right.
I found out, I and everyone knows who the KKK are, but I don't know much about how they operated. But at the time, they were more like a civil group. Like everyone was a member. You had no choice. If you were not a member, you were suspect because, you know, why wouldn't you be? Everyone else is. And they were not just going after black people in the night on horses. They were, if a boyfriend was hitting his girlfriend, they might go and beat up the boyfriend. They were giving birthday parties and holiday parties and rallies. They were very much a community organization, a very brutal, racist, right wing, insane organization, but very much a civil organization. So I'm sure he was a member of the KKK, and probably from what I understand, most white men would have been. Just you had to be,
Right,
just by default.
right. The first major party political candidate for president. I think this might have
Mm.
been 1928. The first Catholic running for a major party office. He visited Little Rock, on a whistle stop tour on a train,
Hmm.
and apparently the KKK had basically gave him a welcome to Arkansas by planting every 20 yards or so for 10 miles on the railroad, on both sides of the railroad tracks, all the way into the whatever the downtown Little Rock train station was, burning crosses to welcome the Catholic, to say, yeah, this is not, rabidly anti-Jewish, rabidly anti-Catholic, in addition to the more to this infamous lynching activity.
They remind like
Yeah.
I read a lot about them, and they remind me a lot of, I mean, the MAGA movement today. America First was one of their slogans. While they were out, attacking mostly black people, but like you said, Jews, Catholics, etc. They were also out as some sort of build themselves a moral force of the community that would, like I said, stop spousal abuse and other sometimes actually addressing issues that needed to be addressed. So they considered themselves some sort of moral force that was enforcing these morality laws that were sacred. So it reminds me a lot of the MAGA movement. I, I kept
Mm.
seeing a lot of parallels as I read more and more about them, about how they organized, the kinds of slogans they were using, how they viewed themselves as this kind of preserving this old moral code that was being lost against these new atheist and leftist and big city types. The parallels are eerie, but I guess
Yeah.
all right wing groups have similar motivations and development, and maybe it's not so eerie.
Yeah, I mean, gosh, we could go a lot of different directions with this. Could we I do want to I realize our time is limited. Could be one of the themes we haven't talked about yet is you do a really good job talking about food.
Mm.
Like what what kind of dishes was your dad famous for? You and all of the family like kind of loved some of your dad's cooking. Like, um, I don't want to get off on I don't want to change the subject, but I know our time is
Uh,
limited.
no, I mean, this is, I think, important. It's one of the main things I thought I was thinking what connects me to my Southern heritage, and one of the things was food, and so it's part of it. It's important, and his best his best dish was by far something he referred to as steak and spaghetti. I mean, that's what it was, but it's kind of a spicy. I don't know. I'm sure it has a technical term, but it was this spicy tomato sauce that cooked all day, a ragu, I suppose, um, over the spaghetti, and then on the side would be some round steak cooked until it was soft with brown gravy and mushrooms, and then you would serve the spaghetti next to the steak. And I don't know if this is like offensive to Italians, but when we would put the brown gravy over the spaghetti too, and it was just so good. Oh my God, it was so good.
It
And
might, yeah,
then
the way Americans do pasta is horrifying to Italians, but I'm sure it's delicious. It does, like the way you describe it in the book, it's amazing. It's
yes,
absolutely
and then the same sauce cooked all day with an extra bit of red pepper and shrimp would go over rice, and that was amazing. He called it shrimp robert because his name was Robert, so he said, "I'm just going to call it shrimp robert." Um, and then his bean soup that he made with navy beans and big chunks of ham, we'd have that with cornbread. He made lots of desserts too. We made all kinds of chess pies and pecan pies, and his favorite apple cake, which he got a recipe out of Southern Living magazine, and he made that cake over and over again. But just or like normal cooking too, he was really good at it. I liked eating his breakfast.
What was
Like
the
I
first
guess
kind of pie? Did you say chess pie?
chess.
What is chess pie?
Yeah. Oh Lord, have mercy! You don't know chess pie? Oh my. So
Love to
it's
play
not.
chess. That's
It's it's kind of a custard, I suppose. It's
okay.
egg and butter and sugar and of course corn syrup. Yeah, it's not healthy, but very sweet, um, very easy to make. And we'd put lemon in it sometimes for lemon chess. Or there was one time we put chocolate chips, which I don't advise chocolate chip chess pie. It's just too much, but it's good. Very plain custard like pie, a little sweeter than a custard pie, but nevertheless, custard.
Okay. Okay.
That was our
And
bonding. That's father-son bonding. So if I talk about my dad, that's how we either were talking about politics and history, fishing, or cooking.
yeah, gosh. And the well, I want to tie this to Turkish and especially Kurdish food in a second, but
Hmm.
it just came to my mind. There was this one. Was it your aunt telling the story about? Was it Mima or was it someone else that got quote frisky at the gas pump? Do you remember that? Do you remember that part of the book? Um, that
Oh,
she met her future husband at the gas
yeah,
pump.
she was. Yeah, I asked. So the
That was
man I
Mima,
knew was
right?
Mima. Yeah,
Yeah.
Mima. And when I was born, she was married to Carl, who was her second husband. But that's who I called Grandpa. I didn't know another grandfather, so we called him Grandpa. And one day I asked my aunt how they'd met. She goes, "Oh, well, yep, he had an old gas station down there in Earlton, Florida. And she used to go to that gas station and try to get his attention because she knew he was rich. Yep, so she would just flirt and just bat her eyelashes at him whenever she went to get that gas." Was my aunt's story. Um, I can't imagine. I don't know what happened. My aunt sometimes adds little flourishes that happen in her imagination and not really. But yeah, that was the story.
Okay. And yeah, that I mean, it's such a different world, that you'd have a gas station on the side and you'd be pumping, but yet you were known to be a good catch. Like, gosh, what a different world that was.
Well, he was a very successful pig farmer. He was.
Yeah, that reminds me a little bit of one of my god sisters. Both of us have both of our fathers were born and raised in Ireland, and
Mhm.
she was in Ireland. It's in some random, very rural place at one point, and there was a kind of a matchmaking festival,
Mhm.
and it was like, yeah, this was it. It traditionally this was a thing. Like, as a woman, you're shopping around, and oh, this guy's got 5 cows versus this guy who's got 12 cows. That it's real.
Yep. Yep.
Oh gosh.
Well, something. I mean, to me, the food connects to this. That so the three ways that I bonded with my father were talking about history and politics, food, and fishing. But when we fished, we talked about history and politics. So I'm not sure that's really all that separate. Um,
Yeah, yeah.
so losing your father to suicide is really traumatic. So I often he's often on my mind. And when I was in Turkey, when I am in Turkey, I should say, and things happen, I find myself discussing what's happening with him. And like, because you asked me about the trial and just the absurd kind of reasoning that was going on in the trial, or even the absurd reasoning that's going on now with these protests. Like, I would sit there and just kind of, in my head, I'm explaining it to him because I want someone to understand outside of this culture, like someone in my family. I want someone in my family to understand. And so I often, in my head, explain to him. So I'm still talking about politics to him. That's, again, kind of how the book took the form that it did, because it's me, in a way, explaining sometimes what happens here to him, and then realizing that what happens here is so close to what was happening during his time,
Yeah.
but with the Black community. And uh, so that's how food comes in with Kurdish food. Like, whenever I eat a new dish that I like, first of all, I learned how to like it from him. Like, you don't just taste it and make a decision like that. You know the story behind it, you know the atmosphere that it's served in, you know the people that eat it. You got to know the culture and the story of the dish that you're eating, and that's
Yeah.
part of the appreciation. So he taught me that. So whenever I eat something good, I'm that's another thing I'm explaining to him in my head. I'm like, look, Dad, have you tried this? I still almost have the urge to call him and tell him about it.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a super healing thing. I mean, our internal dialogue can be a really negative thing, but it can be a positive thing too. And
Yeah.
gosh, I love how you have harnessed it to the larger project.
And, I know you said something earlier that kind of family trauma going down through the generations. I think I was that really was on my mind a lot. Like, I've always tried to find out what happened to him. So, you know, looking, trying to find my grandfather's history when no one was talking, trying to find out about my grandmother's childhood when no one was talking, and then their parents. I kept pushing back. It's like further and further back into the past, try to figure out if there's some continuity here, something that's moving down through the generations. And I thought, well, if like, I go to therapy to deal with my father's alcoholism still, and it was pretty minor. I mean, I know some people who've dealt with some alcoholic parents, who were abusive, my father was never abusive, but still, I have some things to deal with. Like, if I'm having to deal with this from this little generational trauma of alcoholism or whatever is going on, then what do millions of people who have had unspeakable violence in their heritage, like, what effect has that had on not only those individuals but on the ethnicity as a whole? That everyone has some sort of horrifying tragedy in their family backgrounds. Like, I that was a it's not I'm sure that's not my original idea, but I didn't read it anywhere. It I thought about it, that if I'm dealing with this stuff
Yeah.
from a little bit of alcoholism, what are these millions of Black people dealing with? in terms of generational trauma, and how does that play out in American history?
Right, right. No, I mean it's a very good question to ask. It's like, gosh, I on some level, and I'm not saying we should make the argument in this case, but we can make the argument, kind of like an unreconstructed old curmudgeon would say, oh, well, just young kids are soft and like, what the things we dealt with, or
Right.
all you newfangled, therapeutic notions, like, look at what I had to deal with, and I never needed therapy. And I won't dismiss that completely out of hand because think about it in a completely different cultural context, right? Like the kinds of things that, I don't know, pick your war-torn area of the world, right? And it's a very important question. How do people deal? Like, and to what extent are we, you know, particularly white people in the rich world, um, less resilient, right, than
Hmm.
you know, then pick your demographic, pick your counterexample. Um, but nevertheless, it's also like actually what you're saying reminds me of. So I took us off this track, but the comparison you're making, right, between the Klan and what normal white society in the South was like during the entirety of Jim Crow, and the Klan being these fine, upright citizens, right? As far as most folks are concerned. To what extent can we compare and contrast that with the current MAGA movement? And I really want to stress, like, the point is not a political one. You don't have to be anti-Trump, I think, you don't have to be on one side or another of the MAGA divide to like really go into this. Like, okay, first of all, the similarities, right, that you point out. So you have a community that, despite these violent, horrific skeletons in the closet, despite these routine lynchings, despite all of these things, we are the good people. There is this, like, we are the fine, upstanding ones. And look at, yes, we're like, the lynching thing is funny because I just heard a talk recently by one of the priests who works at, he's retired, he's very old, but um, this wonderful guy who's at my university, and he went into the Emmett Till thing just
Mm.
recently, and he did some background research to show that, okay, clearly the community knew about this, right? The larger white community knew about this, and they kept this code of omerta, basically, right? They were,
Yep.
no one ever, like, and yet he dug up this, and the point was not to apologize for these people, but his point was to show that at the same time that this kind of clannishness prevented the wider story from being known for a very long time, it also effectively ostracized some of the guys who were involved in that lynching, in that brutal murder of Emmett Till. Like it, like, and so there was this. Again, the point is not to apologize. The point is not to justify or to excuse. The point is to say, like, that sense of we are the good people, and to find reason, like, to find the reasons for that is just such a common human thing, right? Um, and to what extent can we, I want to ask you, to what extent can we say, like, look, okay, the similarity with the MAGA movement would be, no, we are the good people. We are the good people. Like, it's, and like the narrative would be, and this is a very common narrative on Fox News. Like, we're not the racist ones. I don't know what you guys are talking about. We're overdone. We're fine with black people. We're not okay with this woke nonsense and so on and so forth. But we're okay with black people. We're even okay with gay marriage. I'm not saying everyone in MAGA is, but like this is a common editorial line in Fox News. We're fine with gay people. We're just not fine with the trans nonsense. Like that
Yep.
would be kind of the line. So I mean, I don't know. How would you respond to that? Because we can see like we're not the racist ones, right? That this is one of the common things that you will hear. Like, why does everybody just think of us as unreconstructed racists? We're not. We've graduated from that. We know that there were bad things in the past, but we've graduated from that. And yet there
Is
is
this
the
the same?
cultural continuity.
Yeah, it's I call this in the book, I forget, mega terrace is like how a meteor will hit the moon and the initial crater is there, but then it echoes throughout the landscape in smaller and smaller pieces, but the same shape as the main crater. But I mean, all
Yeah.
that's a metaphor, I suppose, but it's not I suppose it's a metaphor, but it's just patterns. As I researched this book specifically with the KKK history and with lynchings, there's a pattern to the lynching accusation, like how it starts, who they pick on, once they commit the crime, how they excuse it. That, for example, when I was reading about the Trayvon Martin case, it's like, well, okay, so while this is not as brutal and violent as a lynching, this pattern of a white man who is a vigilante targeting a young black man, killing him, and then the way the community pulls together and justifies that murder, it was like tick, tick, tick. Like it was all the same steps that would have taken place with the lynching years before. So in my perception is that hasn't really changed. Those patterns are still there. They don't come out quite as brutally, perhaps, but the patterns are still there. And the same thing with MAGA, like with all of the anti-progressive movements in the states, like this, how the KKK developed, the language they were using, the justifications that they were giving for what they were doing. Uh, it feels very much the same. Sometimes verbally the same. The phrases will be the same. That when people now are justifying these mass arrests, ignoring the courts, all of these, whether they're fascist or not, these fascist moves that normally they would decry. The language that they're using is very similar to the language that the KKK and other right wing groups were using back in the day. I think it's a pattern. I think it's a pattern that's going to repeat, just like in my family, the pattern of alcoholism repeats generation to generation until someone recognizes it and makes efforts to stop it. I think these patterns will repeat in our national history as well until together, and it's a very noble thing to say, until together we're able to face it, recognize it, and do some work, as my therapist would say, to change it. I, 20
Mm.
years from now, 100 years from now, we'll probably be experiencing the same thing unless, you know, I suppose technology could change so radically that we might even be a different species. But if barring any major changes, we'll be doing the same thing 100 years from now if we don't address it, I think. It's like Turkey. I mean, that's what I noticed in Turkey. Armenian genocide. Great. Now you move on to the Kurds and you do the same thing. Not the same methods. You're not quite doing a physical genocide, but the excuses that you make, the methods that you use, the way that you explain it to yourself, it's all very similar. And then denial. Oh, no, no, no. We're just fighting terrorists. It's the same explanation. Anyway,
Gosh, I know
I
we
gotta,
could talk for a lot longer, but I know you have to go, right?
yes, baby
Yeah.
duties.
I would, yes, I would love to continue the conversation. But Jeff, thank you so much, so much. We just scratched the surface, but everybody should absolutely read your book, The Peril of
Yes,
Remembering Nice Things.
yes. If you want to
That's a
know more,
beautiful title.
read the book.
Yes.
Although I will say, just a quick story that I went to South Georgia to do a reading and a signing, and stayed at this lovely bed and breakfast in Thomaston, which is a site near the lynching. And there's a British couple an old British couple in their 70s, traveling the South. They just love the South, and the owner, who was Bulgarian, strangely enough, and had lived in Istanbul, she said, "Now we've got an author staying with us." And the old couple looked at like, "Oh." we've got an author that's so lovely. Tell us about your book. What's it about? And this sweet couple that I just met, they're like, well, it's about my dad's suicide in a lynching. Kind of brought the mood down at breakfast, but I asked. I asked. Anyway, read the book.
All right, man. Well, give a big hug to Dalal, and
I will.
I hope to see you guys before too long, and we'll talk soon.